Chapter 17. Russia Looks West. Peter the Great. If English farmers and European philosophers lived in the West, and the people of Japan and China lived in the East, who lived in the middle? The Russians. The enormous country of Russia lay between the western countries of Europe and the eastern countries of Asia. In medieval times, Russia was much more eastern than western. Russian men wore long eastern robes and beards. Russian women didn't mingle with men. They stayed in separate rooms and wore veils. And Russia's kings, called czars, ruled with absolute power, like the emperors of China and the shoguns of Japan. But then a young man of 17 took control and turned his gaze to the west. Peter I, who became known as Peter the Great, became Tsar of Russia in 1682, 1 year after William Penn founded the colony of Pennsylvania. The young Tsar was only 10, so his older sister Sophia took control of the royal palace in Moscow and ruled as his regent. Peter was sent to the country, where he spent hours climbing trees, roaming through the fields, and playing war games. He divided his friends into regiments and gave them uniforms, flags, and drums. When Peter was 11, he was allowed to use real cannons in his war games. Meanwhile, Sophia ordered Russian troops into battle, had herself painted wearing the crown of the Tsars, and behaved more and more as though she were the real Tsar of Russia. When Peter was 17, Sophia tried to convince her royal guard to attack Peter and his mother in their country home, but the royal guard refused. They had grown tired of Sophia and her tyranny. Instead, the royal guard swore allegiance to Peter, the rightful Tsar of Russia. Sophia, frightened of her brother, fled to a convent where she would spend the rest of her life. Now Peter was truly Tsar of Russia. Peter had always been fascinated by the West, but not very many Europeans traveled to Russia, and those who settled in Russia lived apart from the Russians in special colonies for foreigners. Peter had spent hours in these colonies talking to the Westerners who lived there. He had even found an old, rotten English sailboat in his shed and was fascinated by it. Peter wanted ships like the English had. He wanted to build a navy that could sail to Europe. He wanted a fleet of merchant ships that could take Russian honey, wax, and furs to Europe and bring back all the luxuries of the West for Russians to enjoy. But Peter knew that Russia would never be able to visit the West without a good port for ships to sail in and out of. Russia's northern coast was so cold and icy that ships couldn't even reach it for most of the year, and Peter's only port city, the city of Archangel, was so far north that it was frozen solid for half the year. During the cold, dark Arctic winters, the sun only rose for 5 short hours a day, and the air was so cold that if you spat on the ground, your spit would freeze before it landed. Russia needed a warmer port, and Peter had his eye on one, the port of Azov. The Sea of Azov led right into the Black Sea, which led to the Mediterranean. Azov belonged to the Ottoman Turks, but Peter was sure that the Russian army could defeat the Turks in battle and claim Azov for Russia. So Peter marched his army down to Azov and laid a siege around the fortress that protected the port. He wrote out a demand for surrender, attached it to an arrow, and ordered an archer to shoot it into the city. But the Turks simply laughed at Peter's demand. Peter soon saw why. Turkish ships could sail right into Azov and bring food and weapons to the Turks inside the fortress. Meanwhile, the Russians camped outside the walls began to run out of food and ammunition, and the weather was growing colder. A savage winter was coming. Peter realized that he would never be able to capture Azov unless he could stop Turkish ships from reaching it. So he withdrew his army and ordered his men to build 25 warships and hundreds of barges, all before spring. The Russian soldiers labored all winter, building this huge fleet and learning to sail it. When spring came, the brand-new Russian navy drove away the Turkish galleys that arrived to save Azov. Meanwhile, Russian soldiers began to build a pile of rubble high against Azov's walls. When the mound was high enough, soldiers poured over it into the fortress. The Turks waved their turbans in surrender. Azov had fallen. Now Peter had his port. He still couldn't trade freely with the West because the Ottoman Turks also guarded the strait, or narrow place, that led out of the Sea of Azov toward the Mediterranean. Peter planned to drive the Turks away from this strait, too. Then his path to the west would be open. But Peter needed help if he was going to keep on fighting against the Turks, so he decided to visit Europe. He would be able to see how Western countries ran their navies and their trading companies, and he would try to convince the nations of Europe to join with him in war against the Ottoman Turks. He would be the first Russian Tsar to travel to the West. Peter collected an enormous group of noblemen, officials, servants, soldiers, and sailors into an expedition and set off for the West. He planned to visit Poland, just to the west of Russia, and then to travel on through Germany, Holland, and England. His journey took a year and a half. Peter spent months learning all about the accomplishments of Western countries. In Prussia, he studied gunnery for weeks. In Holland, Peter worked at the docks of the East India Company in Amsterdam for 4 whole months. When he visited England, he spent another 4 months working in English docks. He visited the Tower of London and the Mint. He listened to the meetings of the Royal Society. He even went to a Quaker meeting and met William Penn. But afterward he remarked to one of his courtiers, "What use is a bunch of men who won't fight for their country?" The Westerners who met the Tsar of Russia admired his curiosity and his quick brain. They also thought he seemed savage and foreign. He drank a lot. Brandy, vodka, wine, beer, and more. His clothes were patched, darned, and not too clean. He punched and kicked his friends and advisers if they displeased him. He even made one of his aides eat an entire tortoise, just for fun. "One could wish," wrote one aristocratic German lady who met Peter at a ball, "that his manners were a little less rustic. One can see also that he has had no one to teach him how to eat properly." Peter returned to Russia full of new ideas. He shaved off his beard so that he would look more Western. Then he ordered his noblemen, called boyars, to shave their beards too. He thought that all those Russian beards made them look too old-fashioned and too Eastern. Russian noblemen hated this idea. They didn't want to look like Europeans. Many believed that their beards symbolized a special relationship with God. Some were even afraid that they wouldn't be able to get into heaven without beards, so they kept the shaved beards in special bags, hoping to put the beards in their coffins. But Peter was adamant. He carried a pair of scissors with him everywhere. If he saw a nobleman with a beard, he would begin to cut it off. Peter also ordered his noblemen to wear Western clothes. If he saw a courtier with a long Eastern tunic, he used his scissors to hack off its bottom and its flowing sleeves. He also wanted women to take off their veils and mingle with men at social gatherings. He even wanted them to have tutors and be educated like men. But although Peter hoped to make Russians look and act more Western, he didn't want them to be Westerners. Western philosophers in countries such as France and Spain were insisting that all men and women were equal, and that rulers, even czars, shouldn't have the power to do exactly as they pleased. Peter didn't want Russia to become that Western. Peter's port to the West. Peter's journey to Europe was a success. He learned all about the countries of the West, but it was also a failure because he couldn't convince England and Holland to join him in a war against the Turks. Peter owned the port of Azov, but he still couldn't get into the Mediterranean. And now Peter had 86 warships with nowhere to go. Peter knew that if he kept on fighting the Turks without help, he would probably lose. He studied his maps, looking for another clear path to Europe. But the only other way to send his ships to Europe would be to launch them into the Baltic Sea. Unfortunately, Sweden owned the shores of the Baltic. So Peter declared war on Sweden. Sweden's neighbor, Denmark-Norway, joined with him. Once, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden had all been ruled by one king, but Sweden had broken away and now was growing larger, stronger, and greedier. The people of Denmark-Norway hoped that, together with Russia, they could beat off the swelling Swedish Empire. Peter believed that he could beat Sweden in a few short weeks. After all, the Swedish army was led by their 19-year-old king, Charles XII. Charles was known for wild parties and reckless stunts, such as making his whole court go out and hunt bears armed only with wooden pitchforks. Peter didn't think that this noisy boy would be able to plan and carry out a disciplined military campaign. Once again, Peter was wrong. His war with Sweden, the Great Northern War, began in 1700 and lasted for the next 21 years. The war started badly for Peter. He started off to attack Narva, a Swedish city on the eastern banks of the Baltic, but his army was hauling so many cannons and siege weapons that the journey took months. Meanwhile, Charles invaded Denmark and scared the Danish into surrendering, and when Peter's army finally reached Narva, the cannons wouldn't work properly. Russian gunpowder was so bad that cannonballs often staggered out of the cannons and plopped harmlessly to earth. Other times the gunpowder overfired and blew up entire cannons. While the Russians struggled with their cannons, Peter decided to return to Moscow to check on how the government was working in his absence. Just hours after he rode off, the Russian army learned that a huge Swedish army under Charles's command was only 6 miles away from Narva. They scrambled frantically to prepare for battle, but just as the Swedes came into view, a huge snow squall opened right above the Russians. In the blinding, violent cloud of snow, the Russians couldn't get into line or even face the right direction. The cavalry rode the wrong direction, fell into the nearby Narva River, and drowned. The general and his officers galloped toward the Swedes, doing their best to surrender as quickly as possible. Charles XII was delighted with his victory. He ordered a medal made, celebrating the triumph. The medal showed Peter the Great running away, holding a handkerchief to his eyes, which were squirting out streams of tears. The Russian army retreated, but Charles decided not to chase them. Winter was coming, and he knew that his army might freeze to death in the icy Russian wilderness, so the Swedish troops started to wait out the long winter. Meanwhile, Peter returned to prepare his own army for spring. He ordered new cannons forged and ships repaired. He drafted more soldiers for his army and taught them to fight with both guns and bayonets. By the time fighting began again, the Russians were strong enough to hold off the Swedes. Battle followed battle. Peter the Great took a personal role in the war, traveling from front to front, leading attacks, sailing on warships, and even helping to repair the ships in the shipyards. In 1702, Peter finally managed to capture a small Swedish fortress on the Neva River, which led into the Baltic Sea. He still couldn't sail into the Baltic, which was guarded by the Swedish Navy, but he was sure that he would win the Baltic from the Swedes. Then ships could sail from the little Neva fortress to Europe. The banks of the Neva River could be Russia's window to the west. So Peter planned out a brand new city on the shores of the Neva. He named his city St. Petersburg, after his patron saint, Peter. The land where St. Petersburg would be built was swampy and muddy, filled with water birds, reeds, and mosquitoes. There were no trees for lumber and no stones for foundations. There were no buildings, except for Peter's new royal palace, a little hut with 3 rooms, no stove, and rickety wooden walls painted to look like brick. But Peter wasn't discouraged. In his imagination, he could already see the skyline of a great city, as great as any European city. As the war with Sweden dragged on, Peter ordered every soldier who could be spared to work on building St. Petersburg. He forced peasants and Swedish prisoners of war to work on it too, and paid them so little that they had to steal and beg in order to have enough to eat. Every piece of wood and every stone had to be dragged to St. Petersburg from far away, and there were no wheelbarrows, so the workers carried loads of stones in the laps of their long shirts. While Peter built, Charles XII plotted his strategy. 6 years after Peter began to work on St. Petersburg, Charles invaded Russia. The Russian army fell back. The Swedes chased them deep into Russia. But it was already fall, and cold weather threatened. Charles's soldiers began to whisper about the horrors of a Russian winter. It would become so cold, they told each other, that birds would die flying through the air and hit the ground like stones. Charles, excited by the prospect of victory, told his men to go on. The Russian army kept on retreating until the only shelter nearby was a tiny walled town with one small door. And then the temperature plummeted. One of the coldest spells in memory had struck the Russian plains. The Swedes clustered toward the narrow door of the town, but it took 3 days for the whole army to file through. Meanwhile, more than 3,000 soldiers froze to death. Frostbite took the noses, ears, fingers, and toes of thousands more. The whole time, the Russians were camped safely nearby. Their heavy furs and warm boots and their winter-proof tents kept them safe. When the weakened Swedes finally met the Russians in battle, the Russians were triumphant. 10,000 Swedish soldiers were killed or captured. The Russians ruled the field. Charles XII refused to surrender. The war sputtered on. But 4 years later, Charles was killed by a bullet during a meaningless battle. Without Charles, the Swedes gave up. They surrendered the eastern shore of the Baltic to Peter. Now Peter's window to the west was wide open. For the next few years of his reign, Peter worked hard to make Russia as rich as any Western nation. He built canals, factories, salt works, iron mills, and mines. He brought European craftsmen to Russia to teach Russians how to make cloth, lacquerware, and other goods. He worked hard on St. Petersburg, which he declared to be his new capital city. In 1714, 12 years after the city began, a Western diplomat sniffed that the city was no more than a heap of villages linked together. But only 10 years later, in 1724, the same diplomat marveled that St. Petersburg had become a wonder of the world, filled with magnificent palaces. But Peter had only a short time to enjoy his city. In that same year, 1724, he was sailing to visit a Russian factory when a nearby boat ran aground on a sandbar and began to sink. Peter leaped into the icy water to pull the sailors to safety. The icy water brought on fever and illness. Peter never recovered. He died while trying to write down the name of his successor. When Peter died, the Empire of Russia stretched from Archangel in the north, over past the Ural Mountains in the east, down to the Caspian Sea in the south, over to the borders of Poland and Sweden on the west. Moscow and St. Petersburg had become cities filled with Western merchants and diplomats. Russian diplomats visited every European court. Peter had made Russia larger, but even more important, he had made Russia part of Europe. No wonder he became known as Peter the Great.